Professor Philip Loder, an economics professor whose life had been reduced to a monotonous, uninspired routine, found his greatest aspiration, the seemingly impossible dream of home ownership, perpetually out of reach, given his modest salary. The daily grind and constant disappointments wore on him, a weariness palpable even in the university parking lot, where Dean Craig, ever the self-promoter, stopped Phil to inquire about his latest article. Phil, his patience thin, countered with a weary question of his own. When would Craig secure him a parking permit? He yearned for a life beyond the confines of his cramped apartment, a life he imagined unfolding within the grand rooms of a beautiful house, perhaps with an equally beautiful woman by his side. Amidst his personal struggles, Phil maintained a quiet act of compassion, regularly feeding a stray cat that had made its home at the entrance of his building. His evenings were typically spent browse real estate listings, often accompanied by his realtor Dell, to open houses. During one such viewing, Phil, fully aware of his inability to afford the property, couldn't resist using his economics expertise to inform other potential buyers that the price could plummet by $2 million by fall. Dell, predictably, was annoyed. But Phil, in turn, accused Dell of wasting his time. Dell, with a sharp retort, asserted that Phil was wasting his own time, stating bluntly that with his salary, the house Phil desired would forever remain an unattainable fantasy. Despite being a relentless dreamer, Phil was acutely aware of his lack of capital and unstable income. To escape the clutches of his somber thoughts, he sought refuge at a local bar. There, Nick, the bartender, a man who seemed to possess an encyclopedic knowledge of his patrons, echoed Dell's sentiment, deeming Phil's dream of home ownership utterly unrealistic. Nick knew Phil was adopted by a Mormon family, but had renounced his faith for a romance with a married woman. Even with poor school grades, Phil had defied expectations by getting into Harvard University. His personal life was marked by 2 divorces from the same woman, a woman who had, in each instance, stripped him of everything. Now, Phil's sole desires were to own a house and complete his book, a novel whose main character served as a partial reflection of himself. Phil yearned for a profoundly different life, yet he was perpetually bound by his current circumstances. One day during his lunch break, a newspaper advertisement caught his eye. A massive mansion, listed at a suspiciously low price. The very next day, Phil and Dell went to investigate. Dell immediately found the offer dubious. Either $5 million for the house outright, or $240,000 with residency. The latter, remarkably, fell within Phil's budget, and he, perhaps in his eagerness, didn't find it strange that the owner chose a newspaper ad over an online listing. However, the term "with residency" remained stubbornly unclear, fueling Dell's suspicions that something was amiss. Nevertheless, Phil, captivated by what truly was his dream house, save for the absence of beautiful women, enthusiastically explored the property. After some discussion, Dell clarified the peculiar terms of the deal. It involved co-living with the elderly owner, Astrid. The guest room, significantly smaller than the rest of the house, clearly hadn't been renovated in a long time. Later at a bar, Dell elaborated further. Astrid was selling the house for $240,000 on the condition that she would continue living there until her death. Her husband had passed away, and she had no children. Initially, Phil would only own a small portion of the house, but Dell, observing Astrid's advanced age and apparent illness, believed she didn't have much time left, meaning Phil would eventually become the sole owner. The terms seemed almost too good to be true, especially since Phil wouldn't need to act as Astrid's caretaker, as a nurse regularly visited her. The main hurdle, however, was Phil's lack of $240,000 in cash. He promised Dell he would find it. To do so, Phil resorted to extreme measures. He cashed out all his retirement savings, ready to risk it as an investment in his future, and sold almost everything he owned. Still, he was short by $10,000. Phil had no choice but to sell his old car. A pang of sadness struck him at the thought that after moving, there would be no one to feed the stray cat. Soon after, Phil closed the deal, and his dream of becoming a homeowner finally materialized. He promptly moved his meager belongings into the new house, feeling an unexpected surge of inspiration. Looking out the window, he saw Astrid, the homeowner, in the garden. They had not yet met in person. One morning, Phil was rudely awakened by a persistent bird. Annoyed, he hurled his sneaker at the window, shattering the glass. Later, while showering, he slipped and fell, not once, but twice. Finally, he gathered the courage to approach Astrid, who was highly indignant about her tenant throwing a shoe at her window. Phil, realizing instantly that they wouldn't get along, as Astrid seemed primarily concerned with her property's preservation, apologized profusely and promised to pay for the damage. Without a car, Phil's commute to work was now on a scooter. Craig noticed Phil looked utterly exhausted, but Phil, overwhelmed by his chaotic days, had no desire to discuss it and no time for Craig's article. When Craig learned Phil had bought a house, he genuinely congratulated him and, with a flourish, handed him a parking permit. However, the gesture was now moot. Phil no longer needed it, having sold his car. Later at the bar, Phil, fueled by a nascent curiosity, tried to find information about Astrid online, but to no avail. Claire, one of his students, approached him, her intentions clear as she began flirting, offering to buy her favorite professor a drink. Despite the initial awkwardness, Phil joined a group of students, openly sharing his dream of buying a house. The group had a surprisingly fun time with their eccentric professor. After everyone had departed, Claire, her gaze lingering, hinted that she wanted the evening to continue. Phil, adhering to his professional ethics, explained that a relationship between them would be unethical, at which point Claire, with a playful smile, revealed she wasn't an undergraduate student at all, but a 30-year-old graduate student. Claire was genuinely attracted to the professor, and they ended up driving to his house. The next morning, persistent knocking on Phil's door went unanswered. Annoyed, Astrid entered with a plumber, as Phil had complained about a malfunctioning bathroom. The situation quickly became awkward when Astrid introduced the plumber Boris as her son, despite his other profession and skill at fixing things. Phil was confused. The sale had explicitly stated Astrid had no children. However, the surprises continued. Astrid also had a daughter. Phil, bewildered, immediately messaged Dell. While Astrid was out, Phil, driven by an insatiable curiosity, snuck through a window into the part of the house he was not yet allowed to access. The luxurious and expensive decor made Phil dream that one day it would all be his. Judging by the numerous family photos adorning the walls, Astrid clearly had a huge family, pushing Phil to the verge of a nervous breakdown, as he wondered if she had deceived him. Hearing Astrid and Claire return, Phil accidentally dropped a photo and scrambled back out the window, leaving a noticeable mess. Thinking a burglar had broken in, Astrid and her daughter Maggie called the police. Nothing seemed to be missing except a family reunion photo. Officers concluded the burglar entered through the window and questioned Phil when they learned there was a tenant in the house. Phil, feigning ignorance, claimed he hadn't seen or heard anything suspicious. Late that evening, Maggie, surprisingly, invited Phil to dinner with Astrid. Phil, intrigued, accepted. Maggie openly expressed a keen curiosity about Phil. Astrid, in a remarkably cheerful mood and moving freely without a wheelchair, asked Phil to open an expensive bottle of wine and perhaps too boldly discuss his personal life. Phil, despite his initial reservations, shared that his wife Molly had passed away 12 years prior, leaving him utterly alone. Astrid, in turn, revealed a colorful past. She had been married 4 times and had children all over the world. Maggie, a lawyer specializing in wills, was, she informed Phil, prepared to handle the property transfer to him. When Maggie learned Astrid intended to leave the house to Phil, she became noticeably nervous, apparently unaware of this startling development. Maggie, with a sudden urgency, convinced Astrid it was time for bed. Before leaving, Astrid, with a mischievous twinkle in her eye, told Phil she took many vitamins and wasn't planning on dying soon, which was decidedly not what Phil wanted to hear. Then, on the stairs, Maggie delivered a crushing blow. Due to Astrid's early signs of dementia, no court would recognize their agreements, and she intended to evict Phil by the end of the week. Phil, however, knew the law and, fueled by desperation, vowed to fight. He was furious with Dell for not investigating the situation more thoroughly before approving the deal. Phil, having staked everything on this gamble, was desperate at the prospect of a legal battle over the house. Dell, sensing his friend's despair, mentioned a lawyer friend, Jerry, who specialized in such cases and promised to handle everything. Jerry, upon hearing the convoluted situation, remarked with a sigh that only an idiot would make such a deal without full investigation. Phil, overwhelmed, broke down in tears. Jerry, despite his initial bluntness, reassured him, promising his best effort, though the main challenge he stressed was Maggie, Astrid's daughter, a well-respected, unmarried lawyer. Phil continued lecturing on economics, now openly expressing his raw, unfiltered thoughts, and projecting his bitter experiences onto his teaching. Students, amused and perhaps slightly alarmed, laughed and recorded him when he started using profanities, a clear sign that he was teetering on the verge of a breakdown. Claire, watching him, was unsure how to feel. Despite everything, Phil, with a stubborn defiance, continued working on his book, now risking losing everything he had invested. Seeing Maggie in the garden, he decided, against his better judgment, to approach her. She was, predictably, reluctant to speak with someone attempting to evict an elderly woman from her home. Phil, however, explained their honest agreement and, in a gesture of surprising goodwill given his precarious financial situation, offered Maggie some of the cheapest wine available. To his surprise, Maggie politely agreed. Phil, lifting his glass, toasted to beautiful women. The wine tasted worse than it smelled, but by then it no longer mattered. Drunk, Phil and Maggie lay on the grass, gazing up at the vast expanse of stars. Phil surprisingly charmed her by recounting legends about constellations, a brief respite from their entangled lives. That night, Jerry arrived with a camera, ostensibly to assess the situation, but the truth was Phil and Maggie were growing undeniably closer. That same morning, hearing alarming noises from Astrid's part of the house, Phil, fearing the worst, broke down the door. Astrid was indeed lying unconscious on the floor. Phil, his heart pounding, immediately called an ambulance and the police. The responding officer, with a suspicious glance, speculated that water from Phil's bathroom had leaked into the hallway, causing Astrid to slip. Phil couldn't believe the police were considering this an intentional act. Maggie, distraught, begged Phil to accompany her and Astrid to the hospital, a request he couldn't refuse. In the ICU, Astrid's condition stabilized, but the prognosis was grim due to prolonged hypoxia. Maggie was devastated and, in her distress, sought Phil's support, though she quickly realized that Astrid's recovery was not in his best interest and immediately regretted their interaction the previous night. Phil no longer had his coveted parking spot and was now suspended from the university for his recent erratic lecture behavior and, much to his shock, an alleged affair with a student, which Claire herself had reported to the university administration. Thus, Phil was left jobless and with absolutely nothing. Astrid, surprisingly, had already been discharged from the hospital, looking remarkably lively and overjoyed to see Phil, repeatedly thanking him for saving her life. Doctors had advised against discharging her, but she had insisted. She had been in a coma for a mere 12 minutes but had miraculously made a full recovery. Phil, to put it mildly, was not happy about this turn of events. Jerry, who had encountered many eccentric clients in his legal career, found Phil to be the most unusual. In addition to his legal practice, Jerry worked as a private investigator, a skill he now discreetly employed to take provocative photos of Phil and Maggie. Jerry hadn't anticipated this romantic development, but planned to continue his observations at home. To calm his frayed nerves, Phil first resorted to wine, then, in a desperate measure, cough syrup. In a delirious state, he talked animatedly to his imaginary wife, Beatrice. Needing to relieve himself, Phil stumbled outside and, in his drunken stupor, did so right next to Astrid's wheelchair. The next day, the brakes on Astrid's wheelchair mysteriously failed and she rolled helplessly into the lake. Phil, reacting instinctively, rushed to her aid and saved her life once again. Astrid was immensely grateful. Phil, guilt-ridden, tried to explain that he hadn't meant for this to happen, admitting he had damaged her wheelchair when he was drunk the previous night. However, she didn't listen, calling him her guardian angel and, to his utter astonishment, confessing her love. Giving up, Phil simply said, "Thank you," exhausted and no longer even wanting the house. Astrid's children would likely fight over the inheritance much later, as she wasn't planning to die anytime soon. Thus began the strange, unexpected friendship between Phil and Astrid. However, Astrid, emboldened by his kindness, wanted more and without warning, kissed Phil. He didn't mind. He then escorted Astrid to her bedroom, where she peacefully fell asleep, hugging a teddy bear. The next day, while Jerry continued his surveillance, Phil met Maggie at a restaurant. There she offered him $50,000 in partial compensation. It wasn't much, but Phil, knowing his limited options, had to agree. More important to him was knowing who would care for Astrid. Maggie replied somewhat dismissively that Astrid would probably go to a nursing home. Claire, who was working as a waitress at the restaurant, was furious with Phil for not calling her back after that night. Phil tried to explain, but Claire, whose feelings were clearly sincere, didn't want to hear his excuses and couldn't forgive his ignoring her. Jerry, observing the scene, decided to follow Claire, who, to his surprise, met someone at a motel. Phil realized that despite Astrid's unexpected kindness, he would soon have to move out. Early in the morning, he heard Astrid scream again. She had been taken to the hospital once more.
Sat with a forefend raising the Astrid against all odds, had become a true friend.
That night, Phil, consumed by grief, wrote the 9th chapter of his novel, a chapter in which the main character faced loss for the very first time. In the morning, Phil packed his belongings as agreed. Maggie wanted to say something, but he wasn't in the mood for conversation. Dell, ever the pragmatist, considered the $50,000 compensation a victory for Phil. Phil, having come to terms with the situation, was preparing to embark on a journey, having learned the most important lesson: home is where the heart is. Before leaving, Phil attended a small gathering in honor of Astrid. It was there that he made a profound discovery. All the people she considered her children were not biologically related to her. Astrid had never had any biological children, and had, instead, selflessly helped others. And Phil, too, was one of her adopted children. While Dell continued selling expensive houses, Phil pondered the deeper meaning of life. He missed Astrid, believing she would advise him to dream a little less if she were still around. By contract, Phil was still the owner of the house, but he had no intention of selling it, as Astrid wouldn't have wanted that. Dell thought it was foolish, since Phil could have become rich,